Well, okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started, everybody. Welcome to our first Flourishing in a Free Society event of the academic year. And it happens to be the first ever event hosted by the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom. The topic of our talk tonight, our discussion tonight, will be on the role of business in a free society. My name is Robert Lawson. I hold the Jerome M. Fullenwider Centennial Chair in Economic Freedom in the Cox School of Business here at SMU, and I'm the director of the Bridwell Institute. You may have heard the news. Just a few weeks ago, we launched the Bridwell Institute for the first time, and it's going to continue the mission of the old O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom. I want to thank a little shout out and thank you to Gina and Tucker Bridwell for the new resources. Very much looking forward to that partnership. But it's more or less a new name, but the same old faces. So here we are. Glad to be back. Tonight's event should be our annual conference, but of course we had to cancel that for obvious reasons. But I wanted to give three of the people that we had invited to our annual conference an opportunity to do something. And so here we are. Basically the agenda is to sit back and let three of the smartest people I know talk, and I'm going to sit back and just enjoy the show. The format tonight is going to be to let each panelist speak for about 15 minutes. Then we'll end with a few minutes of questions and answers at the end. You'll note that this Zoom format, this is a webinar format. It's a little different than the normal meeting format. And there is a chat box, but on webinars, they have a little Q&A box. You'll see it at the bottom of your screen. So if you click that Q&A thing, so if anyone's out there, I see 72 of you out there now. Put your question into that box, and when we get to the time where we'll take those questions, I'll kind of curate them, maybe combine a few, and I'll direct them to one of the three panelists or all three panelists as need be. In the Google era, we really don't need long introductions anymore, but let me give brief introductions to our speakers. Tyler Cowen is professor of economics and director of at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. You may know Tyler from his columns previously in the New York Times, now on Bloomberg, or you may know his top-rated blog, Marginal Revolution, which I read every day. Tyler is going to talk about whatever Tyler wants to talk about, but I'm hoping he's going to talk at least a little bit about his recent book-length love letter to big business. Next is we'll have Siri Terjesen. Siri, I hesitate because I'm not 100% sure I know how to pronounce your Norwegian last name, but it's probably unpronounceable in English anyway. Anyway, Siri is a professor and the Associate Dean for Research and External Relations at Florida Atlantic University's College of Business. She is a widely published expert on entrepreneurship and innovation and corporate governance and many other things. Fun fact about Siri, she's always embarrassed, but in her previous life, she was a world-class elite ultra-distance runner and has won, according to what Google told me today, 3 national championships at the 100K, 50K, and 40K distances. I'm an old ultra-marathoner myself, so I'm extraordinarily impressed. She's going to tell us, again, whatever she wants to tell us, but hopefully it'll be something about what's going on in the innovation space right now. And last, we've got Jason Brennan. Jason is the Robert J. and Elizabeth Flanagan Family Professor of, get this, Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. He is a rare philosophy PhD who works in a business school. And he is one of the most provocative and prolific writers I know. And I think he's going to tell us why it's okay to want to be rich or to get rich. So with that, I'm gonna take it in that order. Tyler first, Siri second, Jason third. Try to get about 15 minutes or so. Less is always better. Less is more. And then we'll have questions at the end. So with no further ado, Tyler, please take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Bob. I wish I could be there in Dallas now. I would love to come, and congratulations on the new center. Let me talk just a bit about the book I published last year. It is called Big Business, a love letter to an American antihero. This is a deliberately provocative title. I actually was looking to poke people in the eyes with my fingers. I wrote this book because at some point I simply got fed up reading so much media coverage of business and big business in particular. And it struck me that it was simply grossly unfair and unbalanced. And then I thought, well, let's say someone came to me, they wanted to read a basic book on business. What role does it play in the economy? How much is it good? How much is it bad? What would I recommend to them? And of course, first I thought, well, Milton Friedman, right? Capitalism and Freedom, a great book. I read it as a kid. Look, that was 1962. The examples just are not really even close to being up to date. Then I thought, well, Milton Friedman, Free to Choose, another great book. But that I think was 1980, which now is 40 years ago. So just basic books that lay out facts and arguments in a dispassionate manner. And what I wanted to do was to produce a counterweight to the onslaught of negative information about big business coming from the media, social media, on Twitter. But just to be clear, I mean, this book is evidence-based. So when I think the evidence points to something bad big business has done, I don't hesitate to say so. I think a lot of businesses are pretty crooked, sometimes big businesses. There are plenty of examples of that. I don't think we should deny those. But one thing my book does is look at the comparative evidence of how crooked is big business compared to how crooked are other actors, agents, institutions in our society. Just to give you a simple example, it seems based on the evidence, the rate at which workers lie on their resumes when they apply for jobs is much higher than almost any measured rate of business fraud. But human beings are often dishonest. But if anything, on net, having a business, a big business, a reputational franchise with a name attached gives you some incentive to be honest and forthright and transparent, even if your natural personality inclination is not entirely good to begin with. Another simple example, think about online dating. If you take the company Match.com, one of the largest players in the space, there have been some accusations against Match.com. First, they oversell the product. You go to the website, all these photos of happy people going off into the sunset. Well, look, maybe they're not all happy, right? Match.com also promised it would not resell the information of people who applied. It seems to some extent they did that. That's wrong. We should condemn that. It was a breach of contract. That's an example of business dishonesty. But just for purposes of contrast, if you look at the rate at which people filling out the profiles lie about their weight, about their age, about whatever, whether they have a good sense of humor, whether they actually love to travel, whatever, that rate is remarkably high. And again, we see there's a natural human propensity, you might even say, to sin. It's fairly high. Business reins it in somewhat, but not entirely. The point I tried to make in the book is that a lot of big businesses, and again, here I don't mean all, it's a competitive process, right? Some businesses try to cheat you, but big business as a whole tends to offer you the most transparent, the most predictable experiences you are going to have in this world. I take myself, I am what you might call an Amazon addict. I click on Amazon every day and I buy something. It used to be I just bought books. These days, more and more, of course, I've bought food, other supplies. I cannot remember a single case. I've been doing this now, 15 years? I've lost track. I cannot remember a single case when Amazon ripped me off. And that's basically buying something every day for the last 8 to 10 years, and then pretty often before that. I click on Amazon, what I wanted actually shows up at my door, and it shows up at a lower price than typically I would elsewhere. Obviously, that's why Amazon has become such a large and successful company. It's also striking to me that during the pandemic, there was a large, what you might call surge demand for Amazon delivery very quickly. No one expected. I mean, everything that happened, really, we were not prepared as a society. I think you can see that. Our government still, after 9 months, are still not prepared. If you ask the simple question, within a week or two, when everyone was ordering their food on Amazon to feed America, was Amazon prepared? None of my food deliveries through Amazon were late or showed up with damaged goods or broken bottles or whatever. It's really a remarkably perfect record of service. Another example about business. I mean, we didn't used to think of this as a big business. Less than a year ago, Zoom was a pretty small business, right? And then we learned, a lot of us, we had to teach our classes on Zoom. We had to do our meetings on Zoom. And you might ask, I think you know, how well did Zoom respond? Well, I've had a few Zoom calls where the screen freezes a bit. I don't think it's ever broken off for me. I know people a few times over the course of a year, for an hour or two, Zoom was down. But overall, to go from a small business to quite a big business, the record of Zoom was remarkable. It's a sign of how big business is trying to give us reliable, predictable services at a relatively low price. Think of all of what you get from Zoom. For me, I think I pay I forget how much I pay. It's so small, I have forgotten what I pay to Zoom. Here's the remarkable thing. I never, ever would have thought this 10 years ago, even not a year ago. The market capitalization of Zoom is higher than the market capitalization of Exxon. It's not that long ago, Exxon was the most valuable firm in the United States because energy was so important. Now Exxon is dwindling and Zoom is worth more. And that's a remarkable lesson about big business, that the worth of a company has to do with value added. The process is imperfectly competitive, but if you add more value, you are in fact rewarded. So there's a chapter in my book. It talks about CEO pay. It's a common claim that CEOs are overpaid. People just think this is unfair. What I show in the book is I simply look at the facts. The rate at which American CEO pay has gone up is just about exactly the same rate the stock market has gone up. And why is that? It's common sense. You pay your managers, your CEOs, with equity shares, with options, with other ways of giving them a stake in the value of the firm. And if the firm becomes worth more, they earn more. That to me is, at least in terms of a rough outline, it is fair. It is not an example per se of being overpaid. Of course, you might do that haven't done so well. General Electric, Exxon, their CEOs are overpaid. But again, it's part of the competitive process. It's like bidding for star athletes in the NBA or other sports. Everyone wants to bid for the next LeBron James. So you bid for a lot of would-be stars. Not all of them become stars. Ex post, yes, a lot of them are overpaid. You might even expect most of them are overpaid, but LeBron James ends up being underpaid. Michael Jordan was underpaid. True stars are somewhat underpaid. And then you have some people being overpaid, but that is simply the process of creative destruction of capitalism. Everyone is trying to be a winner. Not everyone succeeds. Now, one of the chapters in my book, it has to do with big tech. And I'm really struck at the news. I guess it's from yesterday, but it hit the headlines this morning. I still read newspapers on paper, believe it or not. And that is the Department of Justice in the United States is going to initiate an antitrust suit against Google. And it's fascinating that if you read, say, the New York Times, you might think the biggest villains in the entire American universe, just putting aside narrow politics, right? You might think the biggest villains are Facebook, Google, and Amazon. That to me is a stunning turnaround of reality. I know those companies aren't perfect. Let's just talk about Google, or the bigger parent Alphabet, if you wish, for a moment. I'll call it Google. We all say Google, right? No one ever really bought into that alphabet stuff. It's still Google. You Google things. You don't alphabet things. So Google, I use Google search every day, many times. It's one of the best products in my life, along with Amazon, and I might add Facebook. It costs me zero to use Google search. It is true, most people use Google. Not that many people use Bing. Oh, is still a minor player, somewhat underrated, I would say. But look, Google rules. Give you the world's best product for free. You might say, oh, Google, they dominate the online market in advertisement. But actually, they don't. They have about 30% of that market. Now, 30% is a lot. I think they probably deserve to have 30%. It's hardly a case that they have a stranglehold on online advertising. And a company on the rise, such as TikTok, has shown that market is actually pretty contestable. So here we have one of America's great companies, surplus from their profits they use to give us Gmail. What does your Gmail cost you? Nothing. Google/Alphabet has invested in driverless cars. This is not a product that really has arrived yet. At some point in the future, it will be here. In part, we will have Google to thank. There's Google Maps. Ever use Google Maps to navigate around a new city or find your way to Fort Worth, whatever? Pretty amazing. It is free. So the free stuff that Google gives you is phenomenal, one of the best products. And if you ask, what is it they did wrong? Well, it's a lengthy brief written by the government. I've only read parts of it so far. My understanding from the summaries I've read and what I looked at is what Google did wrong is Google paid Apple and some other countries to make Google the default browser on an iPhone, which, I mean, probably really, come on, is something consumers wanted. Is there some part of that that is anti-competitive? I mean, I would honestly say yes, I think there is. But I think the part of it that improves consumer welfare is much more significant in terms of understanding what is going on. So we live in a world where the intellectuals in our universities, our law schools, they say we need to reformulate antitrust to pull apart big tech. And the standard no longer should be what is good for consumers. It should be how do we intellectuals feel things should be arranged. I'm about out of time, but one more point just on Facebook. My goodness, the New York Times hates Facebook. The New York Times will tell you Facebook sells its data. Facebook does not sell its data. It rents out to people the ability to send an ad to people with a Facebook account. I've actually bought ads on Facebook for some of the things I do. I don't get access to anyone's data. The whole Facebook business model, for the most part, is to hoard that data. Now, let's say you subscribe to the New York Times. You give them your address, your phone number, your name, whatever, where you click. What does the New York Times do with that information? It sells it to other companies with your name. And then the New York Times regularly run articles criticizing Facebook for doing this and violating your privacy. And by the way, which company is probably the most successful, biggest damaging competitor to the New York Times? It is Facebook. There's much, much more in my book. I look at finance, I look at the whole American economy. It's about the fact, I think it's a pretty positive picture of business. Hope you have the chance to read it. And just in closing, I'm a big fan of the other panelists as well. Now my time is up and I have to turn it over to everyone else. Thank you all.
Siri, you're up next. That was great. Thanks, Tyler.
As always, Tyler, you keep us entertained, and there's so many points to pick up on there. First of all, thanks, Bob, for letting me join Tyler and Jason, because I have utmost respect for all of you. And as you can see, Bob, we've got your poster all over our offices here. It's awesome also on the launch of your new center, the Bridwell Center. So 15 minutes on entrepreneurship and innovation. This is a bit of a challenge. I want to leave you with 3 takeaways overall. First of all, I want us to think about entrepreneurship as big picture, as encompassing innovations like Match.com and Google that Tyler mentioned, but also others. Second, I want to expand on the work of the Bridwell Institute on Economic Freedom and talk about how greater levels of economic freedom are generating higher levels of productive, high quality entrepreneurship. And third, I want to talk about how entrepreneurship offers the just tremendous promise to try to teach the virtues of capitalism and a free society. So as Tyler mentioned, we have these companies that are villainized. There's grossly imbalanced news, except if you get the Wall Street Journal. But even then, and so that's my key point. So let's talk about entrepreneurship as Big Tent. We've had 3 centuries of economists talking about entrepreneurship. Lots of definitions. The one that I like the most is the one that I got in person by interviewing Nobel laureate Ronald Coase at his apartment about 10 years ago on the occasion of his 100th birthday. And he said entrepreneurship is undertaking new business initiatives such as setting up a new firm, creating a new market, inventing a new product, experimenting with a new way of marketing or retailing, or organizing the production line, and bearing the related risks. So if we look around us, entrepreneurship is everywhere. Tyler brought up Zoom. This company was founded in 2011 by a former Cisco engineer and executive, Eric Wan. He was actually like a senior vice president. He launched it in 2013, the software. And at the NASDAQ close today, you're right, Tyler, it's worth a lot more than Exxon. It's worth 145 billion. And it reached its first unicorn status in 2017. But entrepreneurship is in everything else. So here I am at my work office. It's in this face mask that a young lady sells over Etsy. It's in this, I'm at FAU, so go Owls. This artwork that you can pick up in a Mexican market, and that's the entrepreneur selling it. It's also in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies with the new digital peer-to-peer payment system. So Big Tent perspective is important because sometimes, and I'm sure you've got a lot of those all over the US, you've got high school students starting ventures like a lawn service, and sometimes that leads to greater, more productive, more innovative levels of entrepreneurial activity later, and we see some serial entrepreneurs. So we'll take a very brief walk through economic history and highlight some key tenets. In 1730, we had this Irish-French economist, Richard Cantillon, and he identified the defining characteristic of the entrepreneur as the willingness to bear the financial risk for a venture. And then in the 1800s, John Stuart Mill emphasized that an entrepreneur is distinct from a business owner, such as a shareholder of a corporation like Zoom, because the entrepreneur assumes the financial risk and is active in the day-to-day operations. And then we have the economist and founder of the Chicago School and co-founder of the Mont Pelerin Society, Frank Knight, emphasizing how entrepreneurs have to deal with uncertainty about the future, especially the uncertainty of the profitability of these new combinations of resources. And that brings us to Joseph Schumpeter and Israel Kirzner, both great economists who advanced our knowledge. To Schumpeter, the entrepreneur is an innovator who finds new combinations of resources and creates products that didn't previously exist and then just disrupt and sometimes destruct the economy. So that's the process of creative destruction where we've got new innovations, you've got all these new streaming services, and you probably don't have, Bob just moved into his new house. I'm guessing you didn't bring the DVDs and the VHS tapes and the Betamax with you. And this creative destruction happens in electronics. You know, my iPhone's going to be dated in a couple of years. But the innovators serve the creative function, but the creditors serve the financing function. And true entrepreneurship is about the creative or innovative aspects. So again, if you're like us, you're sitting in your home or your work office, you've got that iPhone, the desktop, the PC, the printer that you'll upgrade. But some innovations last longer, like the Post-it note. And this is a great example of corporate entrepreneurship. It began in 1968 when 3M scientist Spencer Silver was trying to develop a super strong adhesive, and then he accidentally created a low-tack, reusable, pressure-sensitive adhesive. And it was another 6 years before his colleague at 3M, Art Fry, decided to anchor it as a bookmark in his hymn book. And the rest is history, as you know, and 3M is a great example of consistent corporate entrepreneurship. So in contrast to Schumpeter, we have the economist Israel Kirzner, who talks about entrepreneurship not as a disequilibrium force and the creative destruction. I have my dinosaurs here to remind me of creative destruction, but rather as an equilibrating force. So where you have entrepreneurs discovering previously unnoticed profit opportunities and acting on them. And Kerzner's arbitraging entrepreneur initiates that change and moves the market towards equilibrium rather than disrupting the existing equilibrium. And we can kind of reconcile these two perspectives by considering the Schumpeterian innovation, such as the introduction of the iPhone, creates multitudes of other new profit opportunities in related areas. So we've got charging cables. Tyler, the next time you're on Amazon, you can find pages and pages of these. And then also iPhone holders, so we can have conversations. So we'll continue our walk with Bill Balmo's theory of productive and unproductive destruction, which he first published 30 years ago. And he basically said that entrepreneurship is omnipresent. Anywhere that folks are dialing in from, there are entrepreneurs in the milieu. But what distinguishes societies from sort of launching these entrepreneurs and harnessing that entrepreneurial spirit is the conditions in these environments. So an entrepreneur can either choose to spend his or her time trying to create wealth or trying to secure the wealth redistribution through political and legal processes. And that choice really depends on the system of innovations. So it's especially fun to zoom into you at SMU because among the many neat programs, formerly at the O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom, and now at the Bridwell Institute, are these indices of economic freedom of the world in North America, put together by Bob Nelson, Josh Hall, Jim Gortney, Dean Stansel, and some other great folks. Your latest poster is behind me. It's not just a prop, it's here every day in every way. My Dean Dan Grapper also has one in his office, and so do most of my economics colleagues. And when a student comes to our office, there's a quite natural conversation about the differences in economic freedoms around the country and around the world. These blue states and countries have the best conditions, as you know, for free trade and market competition, and have greater levels of personal choice, voluntary exchange, freedom to compete, and protection of personal property. And scholars all over the world use this index data for other explorations. So for the last 15 years, I've been part of something called, got to put you firmly back in place there, Bob, something called the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. And what we do is we survey adults in now 95 countries around the world and ask them questions about their entrepreneurial activity. And we try to understand how many people are presently trying to start a company, running a startup, or running an established venture. And then we can bring in research like yours on the indicators of economic freedom to understand. And that's what I want to leave you with, is that while your poster highlights how economic freedom is associated with greater income per capita and life expectancies across these countries, my point is that it's also associated with higher quality entrepreneurship and innovation. And there have been lots of studies here, myself, co-authors, and other scholars, and some of the findings are that societies with higher levels of economic freedom have higher venture capital investments per capita, higher rates of patents per capita, faster rates of sole proprietorship growth, higher birth rates of new firms. And the perspective we use here is institutional theory from Nobel laureates Douglas North and Oliver Williamson. And that's the idea that there are these institutions that set the rules of the game that are associated. For example, economic freedom would be property rights, rule of law, open market. And some of these are informal and some of these are formal. And in countries with strong institutions that secure property rights, a fair and balanced judicial system, contract enforcement, effective limits on government's ability to transfer wealth, et cetera, you're going to see that creative individuals are far more likely to engage in entrepreneurship. But those areas that lack strong institutions are going to have poor levels of entrepreneurship, and they're going to spend their time on really unproductive activities like lobbying and lawsuits. So that's really important, and the research continues. Just last week, I published a paper with Poria Dharmahamideni, and it's in Small Business Economics, and we look at entrepreneurs' growth ambitions with that GEM data, and we see that they're always higher in countries with more efficient regulations, especially fewer labor restrictions and greater monetary freedom. And actually, those effects are even stronger for male entrepreneurs than female entrepreneurs. But it's not just this large cross-country research. When there are surveys like by the NFIB of small business owners, they routinely report that their most important problems are regulation and red tape, and taxes. And later down the list will be competition and poor sales. So US entrepreneurs are really grappling with this lack of economic freedom. And of course, we need no longer, look much further than the last 9 or 10 months of newspaper articles and all the entrepreneurs in this country fighting for the right to reopen their restaurants or their gyms. But let's conclude my presentation with a little bit of the glimpse that Tyler gave us about this villainizing of corporate America. We're here tonight to talk about contemporary American capitalism and the vital role of big business and small business. And I think most of us are extremely happy to live in an economically free country like the US. And personally, I don't know about how Bob feels, and Tyler and Jason they're in Texas and Virginia. These are all economically free states. But not everybody appreciates that. There's lots of critiques of capitalism, and many of them are targeted at our next generations. So let me briefly conclude with AOC and VOC. So AOC is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and she's denounced capitalism as irredeemable, unfortunately, to quite enthusiastic crowds. And then we have VOC, which is the Victims of Communism Organization. Every year they do an annual survey. Last year of 2,500 respondents. And what they find is that, fortunately, across the whole US population, capitalism is viewed far more favorably than other economic systems, but the favorability was still down 6 points and 8 points respectively for the Gen Z and millennial. And their next survey is going to be out next month. So it'll be interesting to see what the movement's been over this last pandemic year. But for now, we know that the favorability of capitalism is the lowest among these generations. At only 50% of those folks in this youngest generation view capitalism favorably. Part of the problem is educational indoctrination. So Gen Z and millennials report that communism was presented favorably in elementary, middle, and high schools 25% of the time, and favorably in college classes 37% of the time. So in contrast to Bob and Ben's book, Socialism Sucks, a growing share of this new generation may think that socialism rocks. So how can we save this generation? My experience teaching entrepreneurship for the last 15 years is that the practice of entrepreneurship, for example, by running a course in which the students must develop business plans and start a company, or by running an incubator that's attached to a university. Jason's got one at Georgetown. With some great people like Jeff Reed. Tyler's got one at George Mason with great people like David Miller. Bob's got a great one at SMU with Simon Mack and other folks. I think these are really important. I've seen so many students move from a deep skepticism of business into a love of capitalism. And when I ran one at American University, I could see how so many of these students who came in with quite socialist tendencies developed an appreciation of capitalism. And it happened through a few mechanisms. One was that we had successful business people who were willing to mentor those students, and they could develop close relationships and really transfer a lot of tacit and explicit knowledge, and also the goals and values. And then the second was when those students would incorporate a venture. And in our old part of the world there, that would mean paying taxes in 3 states, right? DC, Virginia, Maryland, dealing with a slew of occupational regulations. And pretty soon, those students would move along. So many of those students became great entrepreneurs and great advocates for a free society. So to borrow the title of Jason's book, these students probably now believe that it's okay to get rich. Or regarding their newfound aspirations, I'd like to conclude with the title of Tyler's book, that we might someday write a love letter to these formerly socialist students who transformed into the founders and CEOs of some large companies. So thank you again for this opportunity to speak with you tonight.
Thank you, Siri, and also thank you for the plug for the Socialism Sucks book. That's becoming a bit of an embarrassment here. Almost every time we have a speaker at SMU, they mention that book. I'm happy to get the book sales, but it's not required. You know, you said something about how we teach entrepreneurs, and you know, I was reading Bill Browder's book, Red Notice, about his times in Russia, and he complained about his MBA at Stanford, you know, an elite MBA, And he says, they taught me everything I needed to know about business. They taught me everything I needed to know to become an extraordinarily successful and rich business person. But I spend 2/3 of my day dealing with governments. And says the MBA programs didn't teach me anything about what has become the most important part of my job description, which is dealing with the regulatory state. So I think business education maybe needs to teach more than just accounting and finance. We need to teach about the regulatory state and how to manage that without becoming one of those unproductive entrepreneurs. Jason, you're next. Go for it.
Yeah, well, thank you. And as a transition, it just so happens next semester, that's what I'm teaching is business government relations and how to deal with the regulatory state. And, you know, not that I fixed it, because if I could eliminate the problem, I would have already, but maybe one of them can. So thank you. Thanks for having me here. It's great to be on a panel with all of you and to see you again virtually. I haven't seen most of you in person in a long time. And I've been asked to talk about this new book I wrote called Why It's Okay to Want to Be Rich. And it seems like, well, doesn't everyone think that? And yes and no. It's obviously true and also obviously false to most people. But I'll tell you that the reason I decided to write this was Routledge has a new series of books on why it's okay to do various things that people commonly do. And my philosophy colleagues like to engage in finger-winging moralism and blame everyone for doing all the things they normally do, including they themselves do. You shouldn't eat meat. I eat meat too, but you shouldn't. And you should give away all your money to charity. And I don't, but you should. And that's how philosophers are. And when they said, what about writing a book defending common sense behaviors? I thought, I want to write about liking money and wanting money and keeping your money. And the reason for that is because I'm really greedy, I guess. That's why as Bob mentioned, I'm a philosophy PhD, but I'm technically some sort of econ professor and I work in a business school. Why did I move from, and my philosophy colleagues are like, why would you leave a philosophy job to go work in a business school? And my answer was, because I can get paid more than twice as much. That's why, to do the same exact thing. Like, that's why. And I don't feel guilty about it. And they think I should, and I should be ashamed, but I don't feel ashamed. It's actually pretty great. You know, there are some downsides to it. Like I have to wear ties more often than I'd like because of it, but otherwise it's really great. So what's going on here? Why is it okay to want money? Well, I started the book by saying this, like Americans have a split personality when it comes to money. Everyone wants to be rich, but we're also kind of ashamed of that desire. We admire the rich, and you can see that because of all the tabloids, like celebrities and tabloids, and paying attention to like what various rich people are doing. But we also tend to believe that rich people are amoral and vicious people. We love luxuries. You know, I point this out to my students. If they go to Georgetown, it's a luxury school, so they love luxury. But they also believe that consuming luxury goods is crass and base. We love material wealth and we love having it, but we denigrate materialism. We love to signal our wealth to other people, but we find it really irritating when other people do so. We love rags to riches stories, but we also love stories about noble peasants who lived a simple life and are perfectly happy. And we even love more stories about rich people getting cut down to size. We read get rich quick books, but no one thinks that that money is chicken soup for the soul. When Gordon Gekko says greed is good, greed is right, we clap. But then when that greedy bastard goes to jail, we clap even harder. So we do think it's good to want money, but we also feel bad about it. And I want to reconcile or break this kind of cognitive dissonance by saying the other side is wrong. The other side says it's bad to want money. They think that wanting money is crass materialism. It shows a lack of concern for the good things in life. The good things in life are free, and money is at best a distraction. Most people, especially intellectuals, think it's bad to make money. And if you pay them, they'll come to campus and tell you why. Profit making, they think, is exploitative profiteering. For profit means harming others or taking advantage of others. Good vocations selflessly serve others. It's better to be not for profit than for profit. Business is dirty, and the only thing that vindicates making money through for-profit ventures is if you give away most of what you make. And so therefore they think it's bad to keep money. If you do strike it rich, you've taken, not given, and you have a duty to give back to society. And the way that you have to do that is by donating your money to others. So this really does appear to be a genuine prejudice. And you might know of like experiments where people do things like they show you two resumes that are otherwise identical, but they mark one with a particular racial identity or a particular religious identity. And if people say this one's worse than this, but they're identical, and all this is a black resume and this is a white resume, then that's evidence of prejudice against someone on the basis of their race. Well, there are experiments that people have done like sort of like this with regard to business, for-profit and not-for-profit ventures. So for example, Baderjee, Dana, and Barron have a series of experiments, And what they find is that people are deeply prejudiced against profit making. They give them controlled experiments where there's no reason for anyone to make these conclusions. In fact, the evidence available to them tells them that they're wrong, but nevertheless, their subjects all pretty much agree that the more profit a firm makes, the more harm it must be caused to others, the worse business ethics practice it must have. Simultaneously, they think that if a firm is not making many profits, or if it's losing money, our firm loses money every semester, every year, like we're helping others and we have good business ethics practices. If you tell them that a firm has broken the law and hurts people, people assume that it must be very profitable because it's breaking the law so much. If you tell them that a firm has a low index score on social index score and these various measures of how nice firms are, they assume it's high profit. And in general, people assume profit equals harm, profit equals bad. We similarly have this anti-rich bias. All the psychology research shows that people presume that rich people are amoral, selfish, cruel, callous, and unkind. And some of them are, that's true. But if anything, on average, they're the opposite. And one reason, just if you're wondering why, well, in part because people who are very highly conscientious are more likely to be rich, and people who are highly conscientious are more likely to be moral. That's part of the reason. So we have these biases against the rich, and that makes us hate them. And I say to people reading the book, I'm like, if this bothers you, or if you're wondering about hating the rich, I want to point out to something. You are the rich. You're the 1%. It only takes $36,000 a year in current US dollars to be in the top 1% of income earners. So sure, Bernie Sanders, who is now part of the US 1%, rails against the US 1%, but the rich, that's us. That's all of us. So I think the truth is it's okay to want money, to make money, and to keep most of it. And further, most of us do a lot more good for the world by doing a day's work than we do by voting, than we do by giving money to charity, or we do by volunteering. I'm not saying those three things are bad. If you do them the right way, they can be pretty good. Maybe not voting, but the other two can be really good or wonderful. And I encourage you to do them if you do them the right way. But most of us do a lot more good for the world by going to work and doing our jobs than we do by the money we give to charity or by volunteering. So why do we have this hatred of business? Why do we dislike it so much? Well, Tyler's book tells a great deal about why that is, and I can only cover a bit of it in a few minutes, but I think part of what's going on is that we have a moral hardware built into our brain that was not designed for this world. We have a moral hardware for a long dead world that our pre-Homo sapiens ancestors lived in for hundreds of thousands of years of face-to-face cooperation with tightly knit family clans where everything is done on a small scale. And we evolved to be moral creatures, and what's in our brains is what facilitates cooperation on this tiny scale. But we don't live in that world anymore. So our built-in moral hardware is not designed for the actual world of cooperation we live in. That's not completely original. Hayek said that years ago. Further, we have a moral software. If you think about the cultural inheritance that we have when we think about money, when you read about what ancients were talking about when they're talking about money, or you read the Bible and what it says about money, they're describing the rich in a previous world where people who used to be rich were kings and queens and others who literally lived off the basis of exploitation. And so a lot of our cultural inheritance is based upon how people got rich in the past, where they were literally predators. So I think that's a problem. And when we think about profit, we should actually investigate it more carefully. The anti-profit bias is false. First of all, one of the heuristics that people use is if a company is not making profits, if it's a non-profit, it must be good. No, I'm teaching a class right now on this very topic. Lots of nonprofits are horrible. The fact that something's not making a profit might mean that they mean well in some sense, if anything, but it doesn't mean they're actually doing well. Many nonprofits are worse than useless. There's a company called Play Pump that's installing these merry-go-rounds to pump water for people. They're a disaster. They deprive people of water. It doesn't work. There's a group called Scared Straight, which tries to reduce criminality among people, criminogenic teens, by having them go to jail for a couple of days and having people in jail yell at them. People love it. It sounds wonderful. Scare them off from jail. It actually doesn't work. In fact, it backfires. For every $1 you donate to Scared Straight, you cost $200 in social losses because, in fact, they make the people more likely to commit crime in the future. So for one, the anti-profit heuristic that non-for-profit equals good is mistaken because lots of not-for-profit ventures are simply not good. They make the world a worse place. But also lots of for-profits are wonderful. Tyler just explained how wonderful Google is. I remember my freshman year of college when the computer science kid across the hall from me like knocked on my door and he's like, you got to check this out. There's this new beta thing out of Stanford. It's a search engine that actually works. Because you might not remember this, like, but back in the beginning of 1997, if you used one of the web browsers that was back then and went to a search engine and typed in Ford, looking for Ford Motor Company, it would give you some random thing having nothing to do with the cars. It used to be like search engines were useless. And now we get this wonderful thing for free. But beyond that, what is it to make a profit? The thing we have to keep stressing to students and to others is on a normal, well-functioning, competitive market, profit is a measure of value added. You take inputs that people value at a certain amount and you transform them into inputs that people value at a higher rate. And then and only then, on a normal for-profit free market economy, is that when you make some money. That's when you make profit, when that happens. You get to keep some of that gain that you've created. Right? So profit is a measure of value added. I run an activity every year with my students, an entrepreneurial activity called the Ethics Project, where they're given cash and told, do anything that makes the world a better place. And to do that project, they have to use all these tools from economics and psychology and management theory. And they do activities that are incredibly profound and things that are mundane and useless and everything in between. But one thing I always ask them at the end is, did you make the world a better place? Did you add more value than you consumed in doing your project? And the for-profit companies have a relatively easy time because they can say, as long as I didn't have bad business ethics practices, as long as I didn't externalize too many of my costs, the fact that I made a profit means I made the world a better place. I took things people valued this much. I turned them into something people valued this much. Therefore, I've added value to the world. It's the not-for-profit groups, the ones that are doing charitable endeavors and philanthropic endeavors. They're the ones that struggle to know, have they actually made a world a better place? They're the ones that have to do very careful shadow pricing and things to figure out whether it was worth $1,000 to feed one homeless person once or not. How would they even know? So profit is fundamentally a measure of value added. And when people hate the market, they think about all the competition and so on that people are engaging in, but they miss that competition in markets is fundamentally competition to cooperate with others. I'm competing with other people for the opportunity to cooperate with other people. It's not a horrible thing. It's kind of a wonderful thing. It's not how competition has always worked in the past. We look at someone like Jeff Bezos and we think, you know, last year, Jeff Bezos was making something like $215 million a day. And we look at that and go, how can he take so much? But is that fair to him? Think of how much he's done for other people. Like Tyler, I'm an Amazon junkie. I'm buying stuff from Amazon constantly. I've spent many tens of thousands. I spend probably $10,000 a year on Amazon. If it may be more than that, it's got to be higher by now, thanks to COVID. He's contributing more. What does it mean that he's making $215 million a day? Let's put this in blunt terms. Let's go like full Ayn Rand about this. Jeff Bezos contributes more in one day to other people's well-being than any of us watching this contribute over the course of our lives. And by a lot. Like, it's not even close. Like, this is how much good you do in your life, and this is how much good for others Jeff Bezos does in a day. Why don't we celebrate him? But we don't. We condemn him. We blame him. Even though we know things like William Nordhaus, Nobel laureate William Nordhaus, has shown that, you know, entrepreneurs and innovators capture maybe 2% of the gains that they create for others. But nevertheless, we condemn the rich, and we celebrate people who destroy wealth and destroy money. You know, we say Jeff Bezos has hundreds of billions of dollars, but in what way does Jeff Bezos store his wealth? He doesn't have a Scrooge McDuck money pit that he swims in every day. And if he did, good for him, but he doesn't. His wealth is stored in the form of like a big thing over in Sterling, Virginia, that when I press a button will deliver me groceries an hour from now. That's where his wealth is. I don't know why people want to liquidate that and then give that to the government over there. I'm pointing to where DC is, and like have them use it. They're not going to do something better with it. I don't know why people want to liquidate that wealth and give it to my neighbors who are a bunch of bureaucrats and have them do something with it. My neighbors are kind of idiots, you know, like they're not going to do a good job with it. But nevertheless, we blame them. And we say the only thing that can make up for all this money that you've created is if you give some of it back. And I do think you have obligations to give to charity. And I can recommend some good charities to you. Deworm the Worm Initiative. You know, $1, you can deworm 2 kids for a year. Amazing good that you can do with that. Far more good than any of you are going to do by voting this time. So just for $1, give it to that charity. But we tend to see that companies, the only thing that can rehabilitate your business is if you give money back in the form of charitable CSR, charitable corporate social responsibility. And this whole way of thinking, which is very common in business schools, is terrible because it's not academically rigorous. It's bad because they almost never argue for why this is actually the right way to go. It's bad because the theorists who write about charitable corporate social responsibility don't actually care about whether it's effective altruism. They never look to see whether the things that they recommend you give money to are actually effective. It's bad because they almost never consider what the company might do if they could keep that money and reinvest it. But it's fundamentally bad because it's mean and unfair. So to quote my friend Chris McDonough, who's a business professor in Toronto, he says, quote, "Another way of putting the CSR idea is that from a CSR point of view, it makes perfect sense to admit that a business makes a useful product, provides a useful service, provides employment, provides an investment opportunity for investors, scrupulously follows all the laws and regulations to which it is subject, and pays its taxes, and then say to that business, yeah, you do all that, but what do you contribute to society? How does society as a whole figure into your daily decision making?" It's not fair. It's not true. The reality is it is okay to want to get rich. It's okay to love money. It's okay for what it does for us. It's okay to keep most of what you make. And most of us are doing a far more service again to the world by running a business or just doing our day-to-day jobs than we are through almost anything else that we might be engaged in. Instead of blaming that, it's time to admit that that's the truth and celebrate it. So thanks very much. And I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jason. You know, as I reflected on your remarks about your new book, it strikes me that this might be the least provocative of your recent books, as provocative as you made it sound. So if you thought, folks who are listening, if you think what Jason said was outrageous, you should read his other books. He's got plenty of provocation in his arsenal there. We've got a lot of questions on the queue. There's and obviously more questions, as always, even in a live event, more questions than we're going to be able to answer. One of the nice things about this format, though, is I believe we're going to get a record of all these questions, and with some hope, maybe I could share these questions with the panelists, and we could get an answer to you offline if we don't get to it here today. I'm gonna just sort of start randomly with a couple questions. I saw that some panelists answered live, and that's great. It's no problem. But I want to ask Nicholas Kerr's question. This was directed to Tyler, but I think it might be for all people. I mean, all three panelists. So the question is, what needs to get done or to be done to get U.S. business leaders to speak out on behalf of freer markets? Too many here are doing the opposite. As you know, this is directed to Tyler, but I think everyone knows this. Leaders of the biggest companies in New Zealand were critical in spurring the free market reforms there. So why isn't that happening here, and what can we do to make it happen here?
Hello, Nicholas, and thank you for your question. I'm afraid the situation is even worse. So I think American CEOs often have better opinions than what they are willing to vocalize. More and more, and especially now, I mean, California and Seattle, the West Coast, tech world, they are afraid of their own employees. And we talked about Google. This is the worst feature of Google. The employees want to push the company into what I consider to be just an untenable political stance. And when I say untenable, I don't mean that I disagree with it. Oh, I do. What I mean is it's untenable simply for the daily running of the company. So when the Google employees insist you can't work for the Pentagon and still want Google to fly under the US flag, it does not make sense. It is not stable. It is not sustainable. So I think the first thing CEOs need to do is get their workplaces under control, stop being hostage to the opinions of their workers, make people realize, you know, the mission of a company is the mission of the company. It's not primarily about doing politics in any particular direction. Take a stand on that. And then at least we have a bit of breathing room. I think on a lot of issues, CEOs would like to do better in terms of their public utterances than they can do right now, but they're afraid. And I think we're going to see that flip. You know, the Coinbase CEO, Brian Armstrong, issued a wonderful statement saying, my company's not going to do politics anymore. Basically, if you don't like it, leave the company. And he offered people severance. That's fantastic. I want to see a lot more of that.
Okay, thank you. So Siri, Jason, feel free to chime in. We don't have any rules here. We believe in freedom.
I love Nicholas's question. You know, I would say, I think we do see some efforts from CEOs, founders of small privately held firms, because they're under a little less of the scrutiny and microscope and the cancel culture that we're seeing. Maybe we can import some of those New Zealand CEOs to talk to our CEOs, or Zoom them together to inspire them.
So I've got a question from Sandy Thatcher, actually several questions, but I'm going to pick one that I think is directed towards Siri. What is your view of patents as an inducement and incentive for innovation and entrepreneurship? Is the duration of patents too long? Or is there sometimes the patents that, like business method patents, that are harmful? Can you give us your thoughts on that? Or anybody?
Well, I guess I could start, because there's a huge research literature on patents. And of course, there are lots and lots of patents. So we'll start by saying, thousands and thousands of patents, but only about 0.08% of them are actually commercializable, right? So we can patent, but we're only going to get rich, to quote Jason's book, right? With a bit of them. And even when we commercialize those, I don't have the book with me, but the innovators get a slice of that share, but the rest of us are benefiting from it, right? So for example, you could have, this iPhone, and certainly the patents are getting some of that, but the rest of us are getting so much value creation from this new phone. Now, certainly there are patent thickets, and you get, the bad type of behavior, right? Where you take the people who would be entrepreneurs and instead trying to go after, because they have some patent claims and they think they can do it. But in general, patents are definitely a measure of research and development and innovation. And countries that protect property rights, including patents, should have much higher levels of quality entrepreneurship.
Bob, you're muted, bud.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that. I'm going to combine a question by Vernon Smith, who I think everybody knows, and Eric Alston, I think from the University of Colorado. Vernon is asking about the antitrust model not being able to explain why, the top 10 companies are different every 10 years. And why IBM and then GM and why we haven't learned from the history of this sort of churn, as Michael Cox talks about it, or creative destruction. Why we haven't learned that antitrust isn't really all as necessary as we think it is. And then Eric Alston asks about whether we should be worried about market power during these periods of time. Even if market power is ultimately ephemeral, he says, does that not mean there are potential consumer welfare losses through the temporary exercise of high concentrations of market power? And is there a role for government in dealing with that? So kind of a combination question from Eric and from Brennan.
Directed at me?
Sure.
Well, in terms of market power, by far the sector I worry about the most is K through 12, right? That's a monopoly. It's mostly government. The other one I worry about is hospitals, which are very expensive. Many people have access to only one or two hospitals. It can actually bankrupt people who are sick or who can't afford care. I think that's a perfectly genuine concern. I tend not to think that antitrust or splitting up hospitals is the remedy. I don't think you can just take a big hospital and turn it into 5 little hospitals. There are barriers to entry, costs are too high, prices are not transparent. That sector could be more competitive. So those are the big areas where I see very bad and serious monopoly problems. And while I don't have all the answers in either sector, I would definitely do a whole bunch of things different than what we do now. Why are we pursuing Google? I think it's a few reasons. One is simply the antitrust authorities and the lawyers who work there. They advance their careers by bringing cases. And if they did nothing forever, they would be out of a job, they would be out of futures. But I think also with Google in particular and Facebook, they've become oddly hated by both the left wing and the right wing. And you're in a funny position when you're hated by both. Most groups are somewhat liked by at least one of those. But Google, because it's big and corporate and has a lot of money, it's hated by the left. But because it's in California and it has all these left-wing employees, and they have made some mistakes with YouTube taking down the videos, they're hated by the right. So they have very few friends. The bureaucratic machinery now has set the wheels in motion. All these state antitrust cases coming against Google. In society, ideas really matter. We have anti-corporate ideas, so don't be shocked when you get bad anti-corporate legislation and antitrust suits.
Yeah, I might add, and I think Eric might know this, and I'm sure Vernon knows this, but it's worth maybe saying for the people who haven't heard this, we have this tendency to analyze these things with behavioral asymmetry. We go, the market's bad, there's a market failure, and we can imagine a perfectly motivated, perfect government with perfect bureaucrats fixing the problem. And we think that's enough to show that therefore we should empower the actual government to fix the problem. But we don't stop to ask whether they're likely to do it, whether they have the right kinds of motivations. You know, I work for university. My university supposedly has a public good. I mean, it has the public's good in mind when it runs. It has social justice in mind when it runs. But it doesn't follow that any particular employee working there actually cares about those ends or promotes them. We're normal people who pursue selfish goals of our own, often at the expense of the university. I think even at the high level, they're often doing that. My colleague Peter and I had a meeting recently which seemed to confirm that actually with some of those people. That's true of everyone in the government as well. So we have to ask the question about, is the cure going to be worse than the disease? You know, every flaw in the market, every flaw in consumers is worse in voters, as our friend Michael Munger likes to say. Every flaw in CEOs, it's present in the bureaucrats too. They're not any better. And I like to say, like, you know, Tyler and I live in the same neighborhood. Our neighbors are the government. These people are definitely not saints. And they're not that smart either, frankly. I mean, I like them. They're fun to drink a beer with, but they're not saints. They have selfish ends of their own, and they run on the basis of often very perverse incentives. You know, and finally, it's just worth noting that when we think about market power, we often teach this model to students where we're like, well, you have perfectly competitive markets where there's like a million different companies all fighting each other. No one can set any prices at all because there's just complete competition. And then you have monopolies. And then you look at a lot of markets and there's really only a few big players. So, oh, it must be that they're, you know, close to being a monopoly. They're semi-monopolistic and they have a lot of market power. But, you know, I think the recent research largely vindicates the idea that the threat of market entry is enough to discipline companies to behave in quite competitive ways, even when there aren't actually millions of other companies fighting against you. So low barriers to entry, increased competition can discipline companies to behave the way that we want our competitive markets to function, even if you only have 3 or 4 car companies or 3 or 4 tech companies.
Okay, we got a really good one here that came in pretty much late. I like it though. A number of CEOs, this is from Sharon, a number of CEOs declared that their objective is no longer to maximize shareholder return, but is now the objective is to maximize stakeholders or stakeholder return. Could anyone talk about the stakeholder shareholder thing?
Yes, let me get on that because I'm sort of a business ethics professor. Though at Georgetown, when they went to hire me, they're like, we need a new business ethics professor. And I'm like, I don't do business ethics. And they're like, we know that's one of the reasons we want to hire you rather than somebody else because it's kind of a corrupt field with low standards, which I say in public all the time because I'm really a philosopher. Stakeholder theory is a wonderful theory because it can't possibly be wrong. And the proof of that is the most recent book that Ed Freeman wrote with his colleagues. Basically, this is what the book says. Hey, there are all these criticisms of the theory. The theory says what you ought to do when you're making a decision is balance the legitimate interests of all affected parties who have a stake in you. Okay, that sounds plausible because every moral theory ever has said that. But people originally thought this meant giving all equal say, but they're like, does that mean like, you know, what if there's a conflict of interest? How do we balance these things? What counts as balancing? What's the proper balance? And Freeman and his co-authors say, oh, this is why the theory is wonderful. Any answer you give counts as an instance of stakeholder theory, and we're officially agnostic. So it's like, they actually go so far as to say, you guys thought that stockholder theory was a competitor to stakeholder theory. It's not. It's actually an instance of stakeholder theory. Like that book, it was like 2014 it came out, or 2013. That's what he says in the book. So he's like, our theory can't possibly be wrong because it's vacuous. And that's why I think CEOs love it, right? I've seen this at Georgetown, not with our current dean, but with like some of the previous ones, where they're like, the purpose of ethics when it comes to running an organization is to put up platitudes that sound nice and cost you nothing. If you say, we care about everyone and we try to help everyone, it sounds nice and it costs you nothing. And you can just keep doing whatever it is you were planning to do and just put a moral wrap on it. And stakeholder theory is a wonderful way to do that. It doesn't tell you how to balance their interests. It doesn't tell you which interests count as legitimate. It doesn't tell you what to do when there's a conflict of interest. And by the way, it's not even really business ethics. That's the worst part about it. It's a complete distraction. Stakeholder theory is about, after you make some profit, whose interest, who do you give the profit to, whom do you help, who you're supposed to consider. Business ethics is about the conduct of business itself. Are you lying? Are you cheating? Are you stealing? Are you defrauding? Are you engaging in illicit rent seeking while you make your money? Right? And so all these things about, when you run the business, are you running it on behalf of these people or on behalf of these people? When you take a contract to work for a company, you come with pre-existing moral obligations not to lie, cheat, and steal. You have those in virtue of being a person. And the question about whom you help with the money is not the primary question. It's not even answering the basic question of business ethics, which is, what is proper business ethics practice? So stockholder theory and stakeholder theory, they're complete waste of time, and we should stop talking about them and start focusing on the things that actually matter.
Yeah, you know, it's funny that when I was younger, we used to worry a lot about the principal agent problem. And if you want to make the principal agent problem really bad, you know, let's go to the stakeholder model where, you know, everyone's a principal now. So I guess anything the agent wants to do is going to be in some stakeholder's interest, right? So it just comes to a free for all. I got one more question from Eric Wilhelm. This, I think, might be a George Mason student from the sound of it, Tyler. It says, we're reading Jens Beckert's Imagined Futures in Professor Pete Betke's Economics Sociology course this semester. And the question is, in what way do big businesses extend time horizons and open previously unimagined futures to propel economic growth? Good question.
Well, if we return to the Amazon example, for many years, and still, Amazon plowed its profits back into building up the company. That was an example of a very long time horizon. New startups typically, for a long time, may not have positive cash flow. If the idea is promising, they can have a high valuation. If you think about Tesla, most people don't own a Tesla. I hardly know anyone who has a Tesla, but it's worth more than a bunch of other automakers combined. It's because equity markets are seeing where Tesla is headed. They think Teslas are the next iPhone of cars. I'm not even sure they're right. I don't know better than the market does, but the point is markets look further ahead typically than do voters or politicians. Markets aren't perfect. If you have externalities, you may need some kind of remedy. But if you have a great idea, markets will work so hard to find you, support you, try to get a share of your profits, and support you for the long run, because that is how people get rich. And as Jason has told us, being rich is actually okay. In fact, I would say it's better than being okay. It is how you enforce your long time horizon to the benefit of the rest of society.
Well, I think this might be a question for all three. It's from Stephen Penrose. Would you talk about crony capitalism, where some companies monetize influence rather than value added for consumers? Maybe everybody has an opinion on this. So.
I could start that. We're working on an R&R on a paper on crony capitalism right now, with Nikolai Foss and Peter Klein and Michael Holmes and PhD student Justin Pepe. And this is part of the problem, that folks confuse crony capitalism with real capitalism, and we're trying to peel that apart and use examples. And I think you've hit right on. I'd love to hear what Tyler and Jason have to say too.
I guess I'll say, you know, Tyler, I don't want to take words out of his mouth, but he makes a great case in his book, which you all should read. I've assigned it in class and my students loved it. For that, there isn't as much of this going around as we like to say. We talk about it. There is some, and we talk about it. We exaggerate how much there is. But one of the worries I have about the people who complain about crony capitalism is they're often the people enabling it. the more you have government intermeshed into business, the more it becomes that every business action requires greasing the palms of many people and getting approval from people and getting someone to like agree that you're allowed to do this, the more cronyism you're going to get by necessity. So I often think that it's many times the people who are most opposed to crony capitalism and hate it are also the ones that are creating an institutional environment that enhances it. That's why it's we don't have like a crony capitalism index, and I wish we did. I wish Bob would like have his research group create one. I'd love to have it and run regressions on that or something. But like, I guess if we did have a crony capitalism index that was like really robust, what we'd find is, you know, it's worse in the most, the cronyism is worse in the less market oriented places, and the places that are blue on those maps that Siri have significantly less crony capitalism.
I would second all of that. And third, all of that, I'm a little pessimistic as to whether we'll ever get rid of crony capitalism. Maybe that's what we need economists for. I don't think businesses are ever going to argue that much against their own interest, but I think we should have a regime with zero tariffs and zero subsidies to business. I recognize zero subsidies maybe is not even well defined for military contractors. Those very contracts are a kind of subsidy to their existence. So there's a limit to that there. Basically, government should be a neutral umpire and referee and cause enterprise to flourish, but not take sides with really any of its policies. Again, as Jason said, I think the US is still more market capitalism than crony capitalism. You look at the companies that have been really successful, with very, very few exceptions. They're basically companies that have done something highly useful for consumers. We are not like, say, Venezuela, where you have companies that simply are parasites on the state. Again, Pentagon military, that just of its nature is a bit different. But other than that, we still do have some form of capitalism in this country.
We're getting close to time. I've got maybe one more question here. This is from Cyril Morong. He says, Joseph Campbell said, entrepreneurs are the real heroes in American society. Do you agree? And this is probably for Siri, but you know, one of the articles I assign my students sometimes is an article by Dwight Lee about the entrepreneurial hero and the role of stories and how important those stories are for how we form our worldviews. Is there any, Siri or anybody have anything to say about the hero story in business?
I love that Dwight Lee article. I remember reading it at Liberty Fund many years ago. You know, let me say that there's a natural human desire to find heroes. And if our heroes aren't entrepreneurs who are creating growth and innovations, then our heroes might be government officials that are just making the government bigger and bigger and not necessarily adding value, although they're populating the neighborhoods of Tyler and Jason. But I do also worry about which types of entrepreneurs are heroes. So earlier we talked about Tesla and Tyler's suspicions about, you know, about the growth. We know it's a lot about government subsidies. We know it's a lot about government regulations as countries around the world and states now try to regulate away traditional automobiles. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily a hero like other heroes. I kind of like this Eric Lang guy who started Zoom. He tried to come here to America 9 times in 2 years because he thought that this would be a great country to start his career. And of course, he was very successful at Cisco. And then he took 40, he gave this idea to Zoom to Cisco, but Cisco wanted to do more Facebook type stuff. So he took 40 engineers that he worked with at Cisco and set up a firm, you know, that's now worth $145 billion. To me, that's a hero. So I think we've got opportunity costs everywhere, but especially when we choose heroes.
Well, we are pretty close to out of time. I like to start and end promptly. We are in America still. You know, Siri's in Boca Raton. The nice thing about South Florida is that it's very close to America. So anyway, I want to thank everyone who attended. I saw we had at one point well over 100 attendees. And I especially want to thank Tyler, Siri, and Jason for taking time out of their evenings away from their families and such to be with us. And if you are watching us and we have your emails, you are now going to be on our email list. Just hit unsubscribe if you don't want to get any emails from us, but otherwise you'll hear about our future events, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you all.